Thank you very much, Liz. It's a great pleasure to be in Tampa, Florida, at the University of South Florida. Anytime you get an invitation to go to Florida in February, you always say yes, regardless of what or where it is. But this certainly was a very positive way to say yes, and I appreciate the invitation. And Liz said, you know, this is the 150th anniversary of the Civil War, and on April 9th of this year, we will be commemorating Robert E. Lee's surrender to the Union forces at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, which formally ended the American Civil War. And I say the word commemorate rather than celebrate, because 750,000 men died during that war. So this is not something we ought to celebrate. The two major issues that came out of the war was how to knit the Union back together, and what would the status and lives of the 4 million former slaves be in the years that followed. Oddly enough, we are still trying to answer those questions. The role of the federal government in American life, and the place of African Americans in a diverse country. Those are still very salient issues. And tonight, what I'd like to do, I would like to take you on a journey from the end of the Civil War in 1865 up to the present, and point out how the Civil War resonates even today in the policies and lives of our fellow citizens. So let us begin. When the war ended, Union veterans came home. And you can see this homecoming of this Union veteran. He was slightly wounded, but nevertheless came to an intact home. What we're dealing with here is not a Southern problem. It is an American problem. This young black man was lynched in 1863. Well, you can see by a mob. But he was one of at least 6 deaths that occurred in a race riot in New York City in July of 1863. And if we have time during the Q&A, we can go into the reasons for this. But I want to point this out because the idea of white supremacy, the idea of the superiority of the white race, was not located only in the South. It was a national phenomenon. And that's one of the constants of the period in the decades after the Civil War. Most of this white supremacy ideology was located within the Democratic Party. Now, the Democratic Party, two parties, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. The Republican Party before the war, of course, was the anti-slavery party. But keep in mind, when I say the anti-slavery party, I mean the party that opposed the extension of slavery into the territories. Not necessarily anti-slavery in terms of abolition of slavery, or anti-slavery in terms of being pro-black. They just wanted to keep the territories white. So, but the Democratic Party, of course, supported slavery much more wholeheartedly before the war and during the war as well. And in the presidential election of 1860, 1868, this was the theme song of the Democratic Party and their candidates, Seymour and Blair, their candidates for president and vice president, the white man's banner. This was not the Southern Democratic Party. This was the National Democratic Party, and they conducted a national campaign. So again, this was fairly common. This didn't shock the Northern electorate. This was just part of politics. Perhaps the greatest political cartoonist, not only after the war, but before and during the war, was a German immigrant by the name of Thomas Nast. And this was his depiction of the South Carolina legislature. The South Carolina legislature was the only legislature in the South that had a majority of African Americans sitting in and elected to that body. And what happens when you elect African Americans to public office? Well, this is what happens. They're fighting, they're arguing, they're probably partying, they're drunk, and you can see Columbia, that depiction in the upper right-hand corner. Let us have peace. And she's trying to calm everybody down, and you can see this is a total caricature of the South Carolina legislature. But you know, in the South Carolina legislature, this is not how it really was. But you know, we didn't have Twitter or the internet in those days. So for a Northern audience, this cartoon appeared in Harper's Weekly, which was sort of the Time magazine of the period. For a Northern audience, they said, oh, this is what happens when you elect black people to office. And another Thomas Nast cartoon really resonated with the Northern audience. People in the South didn't bother with Harper's Magazine much. It was a Republican magazine anyway, Republican-leaning magazine. And this Thomas Nast captioned "The Ignorant Vote." What Thomas Nast was saying here is that, you know, us folks up north, we have black people too, only we call them Irish. And you can see Thomas Nast's depiction of the Irish immigrant. He racializes the Irish immigrant. The Irish immigrant is almost a monkey figure, not really human. And we got these dumb Irish immigrants, and you got these dumb freed slaves. And the tragedy of it is that they both can vote. So let's try to do something that will limit their right to vote. And this, of course, was part of the campaign platform of the Republican Party. If you remember back to the 1850s, the Republican Party was born on two legs. It was an anti-slavery party, and it was an anti-Catholic or anti-immigrant party. And it kept those two strands through the war and after the war as well. I mentioned Walt Whitman earlier. His brother Jeff, who was a Union soldier, wrote to him during the war. He said, well, when we finish off these rebels, we're going to go after the Catholics. So this type of racial prejudice, ethnic prejudice, was common to both North and South. Now, what was happening in the North at this time, besides being bedeviled by Irish voters? And of course, the Irish voters, many of whom lived in cities and Democratic Party machines. Another reason why the Republicans opposed them, because many of these immigrants were Democrats. This is New York City in the 1870s. The American Industrial Revolution began. after the Civil War. Two major new industries appeared that would become giants of American industrial might, the oil industry and the steel industry. And New York would become the entrepot for commerce and grow into one of the world's great cities. The story of the decade after the Civil War is not reconstructing the Union, is not deciding what to do with African Americans or Irish Catholics. The story after the Civil War is making lots of money. It's the story of industrialization. What the average person was thinking about in the North was not thinking about civil rights for black people. We're not thinking about what to do with the South and the Union. They were thinking about making money, about growing the economy, about becoming members of this new middle class. The war was behind them, long gone. They were on a new mission. I know historians have emphasized, Reconstruction and race and so on, but that's historians. What was the average person in the North thinking about? What were they doing? They were working and making money. Steel mills, Carnegie Steel Mills, Scottish immigrant Andrew Carnegie, and eventually became U.S. Steel. This was what the North, this was what America was about. And that's another thing to keep in mind. The North was synonymous with America. The South didn't fit into this paradigm. Yeah, the South had some industry. Yeah, the South had some cities. But the South didn't really fit into this Industrial Revolution paradigm. It's interesting to note, when we look at the literature of the Civil War, there was really not great literature that came out of the Civil War. I mean, we know Stephen Crane's Red Badge of Courage, but Stephen Crane was born in 1865, right at the end of the war, so he didn't really have first-hand knowledge. And people were so surprised about that because this is a great book. Now, there were people who tried to write about the war, like Ambrose Bierce, for example, and Albion Turgey. But nobody was really much interested in what Ambrose Bierce had to say, because he depicted the war as a bloody, deadly, awful thing. And people were not interested in reading about that, particularly in the North, where these works would have the market. They had moved on. If Southerners said that the war was a war of honor and courage, who were the Northerners who won the war to disagree? Because if the Southerners were so brave and honorable and courageous, what does that make the winners? Even more honorable and brave and courageous. So, let's go with that narrative. But really, when you think of great novels of the Civil War, I mean, this is it. Stephen Crane's The Red Badge of Courage, and it's a pretty grim look at the war, but it was written in the 1890s. And we, meaning America, and the North in particular, this is how we came to look upon the South. This is a painting painted in 1883 in Vicksburg, Mississippi. And you can see here the black people toiling in the cotton fields, the steamboats slowly coming into port, the antebellum mansions still intact, the Spanish moss dripping from the trees. This was the image that America was coming to have about the South. And here in the South, well, I mean, who are we to disagree? This is a very nice image. And of course, these folks are absolutely subservient. There's really no difference between 1883 and 1853. I mean, if you had this painting in 1853, you'd still see the same things. The steamboat and the black folks picking cotton. That's the same thing. So why did we have this Civil War where 750,000 men died? That's a really good question. Landscape is very important, even more important sometimes than paintings. And as the white South began to take back the power that they had before the war, and it was not something that took a long time, 3-4 years at most after the war in many states, and certainly by 1876 in the remaining states. The landscape of the South began to be populated by these images of the war, these heroic images, these courageous images. The Confederate soldier, scarcely a courthouse in a town in the South did not erect a statue to the Confederacy. Never mind 380,000 young men died for the Confederacy. Never mind that the region was wrecked. There's a melancholy pride in never choosing the winning side, said the poet. And textbooks. This was a high school textbook. Now, if you went to high school in Florida or in Illinois in 1900, this was the textbook you would have used, the history textbook you would have used. And what do we have here? Well, Sunday afternoon on a southern plantation. And as you can see here, it's very docile. Obviously, the mistress of the plantation is reading to the slaves, and everything is fine. Everything is placid. The South was becoming what the rest of America was not. The rest of America was industrialized, was urbanized, was dirty, packed with immigrants. The South was tranquil, no conflicts, rural, calm, genteel, beautiful, romantic. So why not sell that image? Pancakes. I'm getting hungry. How about you? And of course, in the dialect, lousy, folks short, cheerful, fluffy, energizer, Aunt Jemima pancakes. And there's Aunt Jemima. It's interesting to note that General Mills, Aunt Jemima made appearance in 1893, and you know, before General Mills took them over. But it's interesting to note about Aunt Jemima in 1893 because that was the time when a new generation of white Southerners came of age. The generation that did not fight the war and may have been born during or after the war. And they took white supremacy and they took that legacy forward. The 1890s was the time of disfranchisement, of taking the vote away from African American men. The 1890s was a time of codifying racial segregation. The 1890s was a decade when lynching spiked a reassertion of white supremacy by a new generation of white Southerners. And so why not have Aunt Jemima? And Aunt Jemima, of course, was not a Southern phenomenon. She was a national phenomenon. Just a little postscript here on how times changed. In the 1980s, General Mills used Gladys Knight as Aunt Jemima. Remember Gladys Knight, the Pips? I'll do my little dance. No. The image has changed, and it's sort of a tongue-in-cheek now, which is wonderful to appropriate this image. But it was played for real in the 1890s. Or how about cream of wheat? This figure Rastus. This is important because in the 1890s, early 1900s, advertising became big. You had these big billboards. You had these tabloid newspapers that came about. And so advertising for the first time became a national phenomenon. And this guy Rastus was, a big figure. Maybe cream of wheat ain't got no vitamins. I don't know what them things is. Of course, he's not too bright. And you can see the dialect here. But he's sort of happy-go-lucky, a relatively harmless guy, but clearly subservient and clearly fairly ignorant. There was a new medium that made its appearance in the 1890s, and that was the motion picture. And here's one of the first American motion pictures made by Thomas Edison. I know we associate Edison with the light bulb and stuff like that, but he was also a pioneer in film. And he also helped develop the process of talking movies, which did not come in until 1926, 1927. But this was made in 1896. And what's happening here? Black people, it was about 3 minutes long, this clip. Black people are doing what? They're eating watermelons. Again, the racial stereotypes. And again, nationalizing this Southern image into an American phenomenon. Perhaps the biggest breakthrough in the early 20th century was a film called Birth of a Nation, directed and produced by David W. Griffith. And Griffith, from Kentucky, wanted to make a movie about the Civil War and Reconstruction. And he wanted to make a movie that would accurately reflect the history, what historians at that time were writing about the Civil War. Memory and culture inform public policy tremendously. Birth of a Nation. Again, the Civil War, great courageous battle between two honorable sides fighting for their respective causes, but the unfortunate outcome of that war was the liberation of these fiends who really took it upon themselves, not all, but some, who took it upon themselves to assume the role of equality. Equality in voting, equality in office holding, equality in education, and equality in love and marriage. And here's one of these creatures assaulting Lillian Gish. I don't know about you, but I was in love with Lillian Gish when I was a kid and first saw this movie. I didn't see the premiere in 1915. But this year, we're celebrating the 100th anniversary of Birth of a Nation. Last year, we celebrated the 75th anniversary of Gone with the Wind. And these are more people have seen these two movies than any other movies in American history. Think of it. More people have seen these movies than any other movies in American history. And the climactic scene, I remember in the late 1980s, the University of South Carolina invited me down there. They have a great film archive, and they had just remastered Birth of a Nation. And I gave a just brief introduction because it's a long movie. The remastered version is almost 3 hours. And the climactic scene is when this black fiend Gus is stalking this innocent white girl in the woods. And all of a sudden she turns and sees him. And he wants to ravish her, it's clear. And Griffith was a master at this. Never happened before in movies. And this is why he's such a pioneer. The camera pans back suddenly. And you see her rushing up this hill. And at the end of the hill, there's a precipice. And the question is, will she lose her honor to this black fiend? Or will she save her honor by throwing herself off the precipice to certain death? I'm not going to tell you what happens, because I want you to see the film. But at this moment, the Ku Klux Klan mounts and rides to try to rescue the woman in distress. And at that moment, a cheer went out in the audience. Believe it or not, because, you know, with the music and everything, you get so wrapped up in it. You know, you want the good guys, and the Ku Klux Klan, the good guys. Yeah. And you can imagine people in 1915. Woodrow Wilson said to Griffith, "You have written history with lightning," when he had a private showing at the White House. It was tremendously successful. The NAACP filed lawsuits, picketed it, but you know what that did? That gave the film even more publicity. The film was banned in Boston. Oh, let's go to Hartford to see it. So, this is America. I mentioned talking pictures. The first talking picture was The Jazz Singer in 1927, starring Al Jolson. And the story really doesn't have much to do with the Civil War. It's about this Orthodox Jewish boy in Washington, D.C., who wants to break from his Orthodox religion and become a jazz singer. But Thomas Edison had perfected this Vitaphone process where you can actually hear the music and hear the actors. And Jolson, by that time, was one of the great singers in vaudeville. But in vaudeville, the white performers often performed in blackface. It was a caricature. It had gone back at least 70, 80 years. This wasn't a new phenomenon. But this is what Americans expected. And the immigrants, like Jimmy Durante or Al Jolson, the Italian and Jewish immigrants, picked up on this and said, hey, yeah, let's make fun of these black folks and draw in the audience, because they'll know that and we'll become more American that way. And of course, The Jazz Singer was a great success. And here you have Al Jolson performing his signature tune in the movie, Mammy, on his knees. And he's in blackface. But by the way, Griffith's Birth of a Nation, almost all of the actors were white. They had blackface in the movie. 1928, the Ku Klux Klan on parade in Washington, D.C. Again, a national phenomenon. The state that had the largest Klan membership in the 1920s was Indiana. Not Mississippi, Indiana. And the Ku Klux Klan sort of was the synthesis of what I've been talking about, because the Ku Klux Klan was not only against black people, they were against Jewish people, and they were against Catholic people. The importance of the year 1908 is that they were protesting the impending nomination of an Irish Catholic for president, Al Smith. And then in 1939 came the second most viewed movie of all time, Gone with the Wind, and what a great movie that was. I remember my daughter, when she was in the 4th grade, had a class trip to Charleston. And to prepare her class for Charleston, the teacher showed Gone with the Wind as preparation for Charleston, as if this was the reality of the city of Charleston. But you know, in 1936, when the book came out, the movie was in 1939, but when the book came out in 1936, Margaret Mitchell said that she wrote a lot of it during the 1920s, and during the 1920s, she had spent a lot of time in archives, a lot of time reading historians, professional historians. And Gone with the Wind is a well-researched book and movie, because this is what historians were saying at that time. Of course, black historians like Du Bois and Carter Woodson were saying something very different, but who was reading them? But people were reading American historians, and this was it. People today still come to Atlanta asking the concierge, show me where Tara is. And in Margaret Mitchell's defense, she really wasn't like that at all. I mean, she was a very concerned citizen, and to this day, she endows a scholarship at Spelman College, an all-black institution in Atlanta. But this is, you know, Gone with the Wind is not a deliberately racist movie. It merely reflected the historical scholarship of the time. And then we have the Civil Rights Movement. Sometimes I say to my students that the Civil War didn't end at Appomattox. It ended in Washington, D.C. when Lyndon Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act in '65. But the Civil Rights Movement changed the narrative. I mean, there were other changes along the way between Gone with the Wind and 1963, when Bull Connor's police dogs attacked demonstrators in Birmingham, Alabama in the spring of '63. But this really changed the narrative in terms of the place of African Americans in American society, and in terms of the role of the federal government in guaranteeing the rights of all Americans. Y'all remember, of course, reading about the New Deal and Roosevelt and how this was the birth of the welfare state. But the thing about the New Deal is that it left pretty much intact the racial dynamics that we have been talking about this evening. But the Civil Rights Movement changed that narrative. That's why it's next to the American Revolution and the Civil War. It's probably the most important event in American history, and it was the first real event that was televised, because those other two events weren't televised. Selma, 1965, which resulted in the Voting Rights Act. And I know it was a controversial film. Right? We can talk about that in the Q&A, but the brutality was real. The posse of Sheriff Jim Clark had rubber hoses wrapped in barbed wire, and they were beating these demonstrators who obviously were clearly unarmed. And the nation saw that unmerited suffering is redemptive. And the nation saw that this guilt that they had attributed to the South was really an American story. Gunnar Myrdal, the Swedish economist who wrote An American Dilemma in 1944, didn't call it a Southern dilemma, he called it an American dilemma. And this was not Alabama, this was America. The Voting Rights Act had immediate impact. And as you can see here, the percentage of black voting age population registered in 1960 and then 1961. The Voting Rights Act was 65. So you can see Here in Florida, it was 39%, 60, and 11 years later, it was 53%. But particularly in the Deep South, like, say, Alabama, 14% and 55%, and Mississippi, 5% and 59%. Well, I'm going to fast forward to the present. Obviously, we still have a ways to go. You don't need to be a genius to figure out what happened in Ferguson and in New York City over the past several months to realize that we still need to go a little further on this journey. But we are changing because we are writing African Americans into our history. We are placing them where they need to be placed. 20 years ago, if you had visited the great homes in the South, like a Monticello or a Mount Vernon, and if you had visited the historic sites such as Williamsburg, for example, you would have gotten a totally different narrative of the life of African Americans than you do today. And this is one of the great values of history, but it's also one of the great values of the fact that African Americans can vote. And heritage tourism is $1 billion industry in the South. If you go to Monticello, Thomas Jefferson's home, they talk about this landscape of slavery. 20 years ago, they were talking not about slavery, but servants. There's no such thing as slaves. We didn't have slaves in Monticello. We had servants. And of all places, Jackson, Mississippi. Mississippi lawmakers approved legislation to construct a civil rights museum in Jackson, Mississippi. And they're going to do it, and it's going to open in 2017 to tell the story of the struggle of African Americans for justice and equality, not only in 1950s and 1960s, but from the end of the Civil War to the present. And here is Colonial Williamsburg. But you know, we have come a long way, but not far enough. Just right now in Selma, Alabama, you know, we had that voting rights march. There is a bust of Nathan Bedford Forrest, defender of Selma, wizard of the saddle, untutored genius, the first with the most. Nathan Bedford Forrest, of all the Civil War generals for the Confederacy, he is probably the most controversial. Most controversial for the Fort Pillow Massacre in Tennessee, and controversial because he was one of the founders of the Ku Klux Klan. But yet here is his bust in, of all places, Selma, Alabama. In January of 2009, President-elect Barack Obama came to the Lincoln Memorial. And here you have this span of years, from Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, which took effect in January of 1863, to the eve of the inauguration of the first black president in America in January of 2009. This great arc of justice finally coming home to witness the ideal that's embedded in our nation's founding in the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. And let us hope that the ultimate legacy of the Civil War is the total fulfillment of that document and that dream. Thank you very much.